Hello everybody and welcome to another faction guide for Divide et Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Boii, which is precisely my type of faction because of their absolutely great selection of shock infantry. Admittedly, they don't have the most tools outside of said shock infantry, but they do have a couple of things up their sleeves, such as very competent turn 1 spearmen, a great spear noble unit, frankly one of the most useful in the game in my opinion, as well as some rather quirky elite archers. Ultimately, they're definitely not a powerhouse faction, but because of a pretty interesting start position combined with a unique roster that focuses immensely on shock infantry as well as competent melee spearmen, I believe the Boii are definitely a campaign that's worth playing. So let's just look at the start position and showcase why the Boii are a great faction in this mod. Alright, so this is the Boii start position, and something that should stand out to you immediately is that you have two settlements at your start. It's actually very, very rare for a barbarian to start with more than one settlement from turn 1, so that's already a feature that makes the Boii start position a little bit easy. With two settlements, you can manage public order quite robustly, just put in the right buildings, you can make sure to balance food, military, public order, commerce, all of the different things that you need to manage from turn 1, you can quite easily accomplish with two settlements. However, there is a catch to having two settlements, and that is very low populations. You can see that your capital only has 20,000 people in it, which is rather small. Like most capitals turn 1 would probably have around 35,000, 30,000 people, so 20,000 is very underpopulated. 15,000 people in Istros is a very small number of people. I mean, ultimately, both these settlements combined have the equivalent population of maybe like one settlement somewhere in Greece or something like that, which also makes sense because I just want to bring attention to where you are on the map. You are very, very far north. In fact, you're not really in Gaul at all. Like, you're pretty much in, like, Germany. If I have to be completely honest, or at the very least, you're kind of, like, on the border between the Germans and some of the Balkan factions here. So you are kind of in the middle of nowhere, explaining why your population is so dispersed throughout your settlements, but also why your province is actually culturally dominantly German. So ultimately, you are pretty much a Gallic faction in German territory. You can see that you're surrounded by Germans, at least from the north. To your south lie Dacians, some Celts, stuff like that. But to your north, as well as over here to the west, it's nothing but German factions. So beware, these factions are aggressive, they don't have cultural affinity with you, and you'll probably just end up being at war with Germans throughout most of your early game. It's an inevitability with the Boii. Now, when it comes to these two provinces, you do have early access to gold, which is obviously amazing. Gold, unsurprisingly, will make you very, very wealthy. So what I would recommend doing from the onset is just invest in gold here. As you can see, your public order is reasonably good, particularly for such a northern province in the winter. So you're not going to struggle with public order, and you can build a temple or something to help stabilize public order in a moment that you take the settlement. So I would do that. Also, pestilence is a risk. You don't really have sanitation from the onset either. So instead of making a food resource here, I would actually just invest in this drained sewage ditch, just to make sure that you don't have an outbreak of disease. And that's the type of investment I would make from turn 1. Now, looking at your army, you have plenty to recruit from turn 1. Yes, this isn't a massive selection, the kind that you get with like a Hellenistic faction or anything like that, but you have so much quality here, particularly compared to our Verdi, which didn't really give you very many good tools. You actually have plenty here, particularly these Boii light spearmen. Their name is deceptive. They have phenomenal combat stats as well as 15 armor, which is really good for turn 1. I mean, besides the more civilized, stubborn factions, the likes of Carthage, Rome, the Greeks, stuff like that, no barbarians are really going to have 15 armor consistently, particularly in a main line that's made out of your third population class. Ladies and gentlemen, these come from your common population class, and they have great combat stats for a turn 1 unit from that class. I mean, this Germanic Levy, as well as this Boii Levy Spearman, demonstrate what you'd probably expect to get, a terrible unit. But no, this unit is very competent. So I would make your main line out of these guys. You can recruit 4 units a turn, so you can quite quickly build up this initial army. As for your mercenaries, you can definitely recruit either of these units. This Boii mercenary band is just a solid sword unit that's absolutely going to help you get the edge over your opponents. Very useful. I would get these guys. This cavalry, not as good, but considering that you don't have any cavalry options and you really shouldn't prioritize building your cavalry barracks first, I was going to say, but cavalry for the Boii isn't particularly good. It's actually far worse than the vast majority of Celtic factions. I think the Boii actually have the worst cavalry out of all the Gallic factions. So I wouldn't go for cavalry. I'd immediately invest in your infantry and just get into this research right here. Like, within 5 turns, you can start upgrading your infantry barracks and get some really solid tools. So yeah, I would just get these spearmen. I would maybe recruit cavalry when they're available. For your skirmishers, for your early army, you don't really need a ton. In all honesty, you can survive entirely just with these spearmen, spamming them, as well as this assault infantry. They are pretty good. 21 charge bonus is great. These guys do 16 armor penetrating damage, which is phenomenal. That's better than like a Thracian unit or anything like that, while also having great combat stats. I mean, just overall, this Boii assault infantry is pretty stacked. Yeah, their armor and morale isn't phenomenal by any means. However, this unit's absolutely competent for early game. These guys will provide a great amount of shock element to your first army. So yeah, I would get some of these, maybe like 4 of them, and then like a bunch of spears, maybe get a couple more of these Boii slingers just in case. You can recruit Germanic hunters, but the slingers are cheaper, so I would just go for the slingers. They're, Celtic slingers are always good, so you can get those guys. Now, when it comes to your diplomacy, as I mentioned, you have a lot of Germanic factions to your north as well as to your west, and you have some Celtic factions that you will have cultural affinity with to your south. I would immediately just befriend the Celtic factions. These guys are going to eventually fall to the Romans, but they should serve as a sort of buffer to help keep the Romans out for now, so I absolutely would just befriend them and chill, at least the ones that will allow you to. There are some factions that will give you trade agreements from turn 1. Or is it just a Nori? I remember in my playthrough, I think I got 2 trade agreements. The Swebi are like okay with it. Like, they're not super motivated, but they'll take one. I mean, you could, in theory, get a trade agreement with the Swebi, but considering that they're right here and you might want to just wipe them out right away, it might not be smart to, but definitely get one with the Nori, as I did there. And then when it comes to your first conquest, I would undoubtedly just focus on uniting your early province. This Germanic faction over here, the Ubi, if they're not particularly strong, you can definitely wipe them out with a well-planned out assault by this army. Considering that you can recruit 4 units a turn and they can only recruit 3 due to them only having 1 settlement, you can quite easily just go and take them out. So I see no reason not to. I think you should just pounce on these guys and make quick work of them, and afterwards I'd conquer north. It's just inevitable that these Germanic factions will get aggressive, and as well as once you conquer their territory, they are pretty easily defensible. I mean, like, Lugia is right against the edge of the map here at the Baltic Sea. Same thing with Swabia, as well as Germania Magna to an extent. I just feel like taking all of these territories would be extraordinarily prudent. Once you've done that, I feel like it is a natural next step to actually move into, the steppe territories in Sarmatia right here from Lugia. Just, head south and bridge into this area. And the reason why I believe this is because I think the Boii have a great counter steppe army. They have pretty good skirmishers as well as excellent cheap spears, as I've already demonstrated, who have javelins. So why not just throw, those spears and use those archers and slingers to wreak havoc on the horse archers of the Sarmatians? And then once you take that, you'll have such an easily defensible string of northern territories to fuel your economy. Lugia, Swabia, Sarmatia, and the Bosphorus will bankroll your entire campaign. So considering that, as well as your quite competent early game army, I don't think that this is a particularly hard start position to navigate. You just have to get very aggressive from the onset, because if you don't capture territory quickly, the Germans will gain strength and wipe you out together. So you do have to be a little bit careful, but besides that, not too hard with the Boii. You're in a prime position to conquer your neighbors and make a name for yourself. Now let's look at the Boii buffs and debuffs to figure out what the quirks of the faction are. Now, the Boii come with a pretty interesting mix of buffs and debuffs that will modify the way you play your campaign slightly, but ultimately I don't think that it's like a particularly significant groups of buffs and debuffs. I mean, you do start out with the typical Celtic one, which is +1 experience for Gallic cavalry recruits. Of course, this is a great quality of life thing, but considering that the Boii have like the worst cavalry amongst all the Celtic factions, I obviously don't think that this is immensely useful. It will help your cavalry not suck as much, but ultimately it won't have as much positive impact on you as you would with better cavalry, like that of the Nervii or that of the Arverni. This increased population from temples when culture is dominant is cool. Of course, you're not going to be conquering a lot of peoples whom are of your culture, so ultimately it will take a little bit of time for this bonus to help, but considering how necessary it will be for you to convert Germans as well as nomadic people into Gauls or into Celts, this could be useful because you will have temples in most of your provinces, so I could see this definitely being useful. Moving on, you have decreased recruitment costs for local units. This applies to AOR units, area recruitment units. I mean, just in general, this is kind of cool, but from what I've seen in my limited time playing as the Boii, it doesn't really decrease the cost that much. You still will definitely have a much better time recruiting units from your own roster, but I mean, it's there. It's a nice little bonus, I suppose, but not really anything crazy. Diplomatic bonus with Celts is definitely useful, particularly if you want to focus on, like, you know, taking German territories, and, you know, you'll get new borders with different Celtic factions, and you might want to create positive diplomatic treaties with them just so you can avoid conflict. It is useful. Like, this bonus will definitely help you navigate the map and just kind of not be overextended if you play your cards right, so totally a useful thing. Now, morale penalty against Germans does suck, though, because you'll inevitably be fighting Germans. They're just all around you, and you can't trust them. You can't trust the Germans as the Boii, because the Germans are such expansionist factions from like the very onset. The Suebi and Lugi, they will make an empire that spreads all the way down to Macedon if you let them. So at the end of the day, you will have to fight the Germans pretty early on, and a morale penalty does suck. I have noticed, though, that the Boii roster at early game is just better, in my opinion, than the Germanic ones. I mean, I could beat the Boii with the Germans, don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, I feel like you can quite easily conquer this debuff if you just, you know, play your battles well. So it definitely doesn't have to hurt you that much, but it is an annoyance without a doubt. But anyway, guys, those are the debuffs and buffs that the Boii have. Now let's get into the good stuff, into the roster of the Boii. Now, the Boii have a pretty unique roster, primarily because they have lots of shock infantry. They have really interesting and unique options for shock infantry, that is. Their spears are also quite cool, specifically for melee spears, not this one phalanx, which sucks. But specifically these two melee spears are unique in their own ways. It will definitely play a significant role in your campaign, along with his melee infantry element. When it comes to her missile infantry, they don't have many options, but they do have some cool archers as well as generic Celtic slingers, which are always good. For cavalry is a weakness, though. At the end of the day, this roster is pretty small, so don't expect absolute greatness out of the Boii. They have some good tools, but not enough to ever be considered an elite faction. But I just feel like this Boii roster has character, and as I explained the purpose and role of every single unit, I'm sure that purpose will become immensely clear. The other thing I do want to mention is that the Boii do have a pretty easy time recruiting their roster population-wise. A lot of her best units come from her second population class, including their elite swordsmen, which is a pretty big advantage. Like, when I noticed that the Boii swordsmen were marginally weaker than like the Arverni ones and stuff, I thought to myself that maybe they're not a very good faction. But then the Arverni swordsmen come from the first population class, and the Boii come from the second. Considering that the Boii aren't that much worse, like 3 armor less, I feel like that's a worthy sacrifice to get much easily recruitable swordsmen. So anyway, guys, let's start as we always. from the generals and just get right into analyzing these units. Now, the Boii Noble Spearmen are a pretty unique unit. Like, from the outside, it might not look that crazy, but, you know, they have 225 men. That's the main perk of his unit, as well as a volley of javelins. 225 men, a volley of javelins. Sure, they're not the most maneuverable unit because they move with 2 speed, but they're heavy, so that's justifiable. And look at their stats. 9, 20, 21, 26, those are absolutely elite spearman stats. These stats replicate that of the best hoplites in the game, yet this unit has 225 men and is, you know, they'll fight in a much looser formation than hoplites, giving this unit a lot of utility. 25 bonus versus Cavalry 2 is great. 48 morale ain't bad. They have a defensive formation if need be, if you need to convert them into something that's just going to hold a desperate position for a while. But ultimately, these guys will be so great at strengthening your main line or playing an anti-cavalry role on the flanks. Just overall, this unit has so much capacity just because of how solid it is. It's just a very, very solid unit. It's not game-breaking. It's not absurdly strong, but it's just so solid. Like, it will beat 90% of the units in Divide at Impera. Not the best unit, very best units in the game, but it'll beat everything that's unexceptional. And that's why this is just such a good unit, such a stable unit to have in your hands. Now, it does come from your first population class, so you're somewhat constrained in your ability to recruit them, but every time that you get the opportunity to have a couple of these in your armies, take them. They're so defendable, so good. You know, just elite spearman stats, but you get 225 and they're heavy. Just so freaking good. Now, your Boii Noble Swordsmen are phenomenal. And frankly, if I was you, I would select this unit as your general a lot of the time. Like, this Noble Spearman is a great unit to have amongst your army, you know, to have a couple of them, you know, just for the utility of them, for the additional stability. But you want your general to be a unit that can just go into the thick of it and kill. And this Boii Noble Swordsman is absolutely that unit. They're as good as the Arverni Swordsman, but they're not recruitable typically. Like, this is a general-only unit, mind you. So this is the only chance that you'll get a 38 armor swordsman while maintaining the, you know, elite 21 charge bonus, you know, better than Romans, 30 weapon damage that you'd expect of like an elite Celtic warrior. Just overall, this is like such a solid unit. There really aren't swordsmen that are significantly better than this in the game. This is almost as good as it could possibly get. And it is just such a solid unit. You can see it has identical stats to this late Gallic Oathsworn from the Arverni, yet you can get them turn 1. This is not a late game unit. So just such a great unit. These guys will dominate the cheaper levy style units that you'll find in early game and never go out of fashion. Like, from turn 1 to turn 1000, this is just going to be a competitive, extremely solid unit. Just get them. Now, your early game cavalry general is this guy, and statistically, it's worse than a Greek citizen cavalry by a little bit. It has the same combat stats while having slightly less armor. Now, while I typically do advise that you bring a cavalry general just because of the superior survivability and maneuverability of cavalry, I can't advise it here. Like, this is these two units, the spearmen and the swordsman, although I think swordsmen are just generally more useful, but regardless, the swordsman and the spearman are both extremely capable, competitive units, but this one isn't. This is just such a mediocre cavalry unit that I would just not suggest bringing in. Like, you want a unit that actually has a purpose in your army. And besides wiping out skirmishers and hitting the occasional safe hammer and anvil, I'd never bring this noble bodyguard from the Boii, so screw them. I wouldn't bring him. As you get into late game, you do get the late Boii noble bodyguard, and with this unit we can talk. This is like your average elite melee cavalry general. It's nothing exceptional, but it's average, which is good enough. And I mean, elite melee cavalry general is nothing to scoff at. Great combat stats, very competent charge bonus, good armor, survivable for sure, great morale, they won't rout very easily. Just overall, a really, really solid unit. I do want to point out that they're worse than that of the Arverni general. They're worse than that of the Nervii general. I mean, they're just worse than a lot of Celtic cavalry, just in general. They're better than the Galatian one, so there is that. Yeah, they're better than the Galatian one. I didn't actually know that. More you know. But, you know, at the end of the day, I do want to just demonstrate that they're kind of average. They're better than some general units. They're worse than others. They're definitely good enough to bring. So if you're dead set on bringing some sort of cavalry general, bring these guys, but I never recruit the early ones. So from turn 90, you'll get access to these, and they can be worth it there. Now, when it comes to your melee infantry, you start out with his Boii assault infantry. I did cover it when we were on the campaign map. Absolutely great early game infantry. It's not like you're going to be using these guys throughout your campaign. They will eventually just be too underpowered to do that. But with 20 charge bonus and amazing armor penetrating damage, this is just a great shock unit to have in early game. Dare I say that these guys are better than Thracians. Better than the turn 1 Thracian footmen. By a reasonable amount, I think, honestly. Just that 16 armor penetration is absolutely absurd. It is so good. It is so freaking good. Admittedly, you might not fight the most armor, but if you use these guys to like fight enemy phalanxes, like Germanic style phalanxes, which they do tend to bring, basically all the German factions have like heavy spearmen and stuff, these guys will just be a great tool to help break those guys. Now, they don't have amazing morale, and their armor is definitely valuable. You know, there's definitely worse than 10 armor units in early game, but 10 armor is very low. So be careful about using these guys and overexposing them. You never want to make a main line out of these guys, but, you know, having like 4 of them in your army and just deploying them on your flanks or behind your main line and charging them in periodically will absolutely do you wonders. Now, moving on to this Celtic Swordsmaster. It is a very, very good unit. Very cost-effective. They're not very expensive to recruit, but they do come from your first population class. And, you know, you'll see why, but your first population class is used for quite a few important units, so you do have to consider whether this is what you want to spend your first population class on. But if you do, I don't think you'll be disappointed. They are so good. This is like a Thracian noble in terms of its purpose and use on the battlefield. 36 charge bonus is obscene. 25 weapon damage is really good to help complement that. And 17 melee attack is crazy. Now, this unit will die in prolonged combat due to it having low armor, no shield. You know, 25 armor isn't horrible, you know, but for a noble unit, it is pretty low. And again, no shield as well as low melee defense means that a lot's going to hit these guys. A lot is going to hit these guys. Also, medium melee mass means that they do have a vulnerability against cavalry, particularly on the charge. So be mindful. This unit definitely is vulnerable. You maybe want to have like 1 or 2 in the back of your army and throw them in more like late game. You don't really want these guys being pushed into the initial charge, particularly because all the factions around you will have a lot of javelins. And this is exactly the type of unit that takes a lot of casualties from a couple of javelin volleys. So yeah, be mindful. Like, this definitely isn't like a mainline unit like Thracian infantry are. However, this is definitely one of those X-Factor units. One of those units that can turn a battle around single-handedly if you save them to late game. So that's the purpose of this unit. Very, very competent, amazing unit. Chef's kiss, one of the best tools at your disposal. Now, your early Boii medium swordsmen are an absolutely phenomenal and extremely useful unit. Yes, you do need to wait a little bit of time to get them. I think that they're like a Barrack 3 unit, if I'm not mistaken. However, once you do get them, they will be a humongous force for you. Firstly, keep in mind that these guys come from your second population class, which is much preferable to your first population class, of course. Now, amongst like barbarian swords, this is one of the more offensive, like chargey types. 21 charge bonus is really good for a sword. 30 weapon damage means that they'll just be offensively very capable. But, you know, on the defense, they do have some problems because they have 15 armor. You know, a lot of, like, the stable swordsmen that barbarians have will have more armor than that. So ultimately, like, you want to pair these guys with spears. You want to pair these guys with spears that are just going to last longer. If you make a full line of these guys, you know, they're a little bit finicky. They're a little bit finicky. You know? I wouldn't really recommend having just, like your main line made out of this unit. I feel like you have to pair some spears in there, like to just keep in the deep center. But these guys can kind of patrol like maybe the outer edges of your main line, if that makes any sense. You want to keep them a little bit out of peril. You don't want them like deep into center. But the art is so offensively competent. Like if you can manage to avoid getting out skirmished and just get them into a clean fight, they will wipe the floor with almost anything in early games. So definitely a very powerful unit. Now your Boii Axemen, these guys are really good. I love this unit because how many axe units have 30 armor? Almost none. The vast majority of axe units have maybe 15 armor, 20 if they're elite. Even some of the best ones in the game have like 25, but 30 is unheard of. And axe units are just phenomenal shock infantry that penetrate through armor with a rabid 14 armor penetration as well as 28 charge bonus, making these guys incredibly good at the charge. Axe units tend to not survive particularly well, but with 30 armor, I think that these guys will survive just fine. I think that they'll do an excellent job in prolonged melee. Now, because their melee attack and melee defense is not the best, you don't really want to have these guys in like your main line. But once again, this is like one of those units that's going to help you break the enemy. Now, these guys come from your second population class, so I feel like they're kind of a cheaper alternative to bringing your sword masters. I'd say that your sword masters are riskier, but have the potential to kill a lot more than your axemen. But your axemen are much safer because they have double the armor as well as shields, and you can recruit them a lot easier. So if you're not bringing your sword masters, then bring the axemen. They'll play essentially the same role as the sword masters, but not die as easily. Now, this Boii heroic swordsman, it comes from your second population class, so I guess theoretically I shouldn't really be as harsh on them as I'm about to be, but I don't like this unit. I really don't like this unit because it has very low survivability. You know, it's a light infantry unit. It has only 10 armor, so it's equivalent to your stupid Boii assault infantry, which is basically a bunch of peasants armed with clubs. That these guys are supposed to come from your elite class, they're supposed to come from your warrior class, yet they only have 22 charge bonus, only marginally better than your early medium swordsman. And yeah, we do have more attack and more weapon damage. I'm not saying that this unit's offensively incapable, but it's just that light mass combined with the 10 armor will make this really weak. And the Arverni version of this actually has a really good charge bonus. They do come from your first population class, but the Arverni version of this has 28 charge, which is actually exceptional. This one doesn't charge very hard. They don't do armor penetration. I just feel like this is such a risky unit to bring, but its real like ability is to grind a unit down over time. So it's like you don't want a unit that is kind of easy to kill, but the way that they kill is that they grind down the enemy over time. But it's not really a particularly effective combination in my opinion. So I just don't know why you'd bring these guys over an Axeman. Because like this is not a stable unit. This is again supposed to be like an X Factor unit. But I'd take something with a much higher charge bonus. Like I'd rather have a Celtic Swordsman or a Boii Axeman any day of the week. I wouldn't use the Boii Heroic Swordsman. Now in late game, this is going to be your staple unit. Like once you hit turn 90 and you unlock these guys, it's just game over. Because these guys come from your second population class. And they're just so good. These guys, you know, they're like the Arverni Swordsmen. They'll go toe-to-toe with Roman Praetorians or Roman Legionaries and stand their ground or win. Simple as that. Like, they are as competent as any elite swordsman in the game. There are marginally better swordsmen, like the Oathsworn of the Boii of the Arverni are better. There's plenty of Roman units that could probably beat these guys in a prolonged slog, but at the end of the day, these guys are just top tier within that really good late infantry stable swords unit type of thing. These guys have like shock capabilities because they do really high weapon damage and have a good charge, but that's not really their specialty. These guys are more of like a stable sword unit. Like they do hit pretty hard in the charge, but ultimately unless it's like against lower tier units which will cleave through really quickly, it will take them a little bit of time to kill like an elite unit. It's as simple as that. Against elite units, they're more of like a grindy killer, but they'll absolutely get it done. And when you pair them with your shock capabilities, like that of your Axemen as well as that of your Swordmasters, they'll just make a lethal combination that you can kill almost the infantry of any faction with. Just really, really good. Now for your spear infantry, I'm just not going to talk about the Boii levy spearmen much. This is a really, really bad levy spearman. Really cheap, but horrible stats. Like, you have weak attack, weak defense, no armor. Just a terrible levy. Nothing good about this levy besides the cost. But your Boii light spearmen are pretty good. They are pretty good. Like, they're only moderately worse than a Freo spear, but you can recruit them turn 1. And Freo spears are unlocked, you know, they're unlocked in like turn 60. So really, really good for what they are. What is he? 7, 17, 18, 22. 7, 16, 18, 22. I mean, like literally 5 less armor, 1 less melee defense, I think a little bit less morale. Yeah, a little bit less morale. Still same movement speed and 1 ammunition. I mean, yeah, they're worse, but you don't need to work at all to recruit these guys. You just get them. So for early game, these light spearmen are absolutely phenomenal. Great unit. Late game, they'll be outclassed and, you know, they'll be relegated to merely like a cheap flank anti-cavalry unit. You know, something that can fight against skirmishers, drive away cavalry, fight against enemy levies. But ultimately, like, these guys are really good. They're basically a levy-style unit, in my opinion, and they're really good for a levy-style unit. You know, totally bring them for cost efficiency stake, as well as make them the main line of your early game armies. Now, for your armies, once you get a little bit wealthier, consider integrating a couple of these noble spearmen into your main line. Like, I already covered them up here. You know, they're not, like, an amazing unit when it comes to just killing things. Like, they will kill plenty, particularly of, like, low and mid-tier units, because this is an elite tier unit and a pretty good one at that. Like, they will do really, really well. But at the end of the day, like, these guys, their main asset in the context of this roster is just to be very stable. If you have like 3 or 4 of these guys in the center of an army, they'll just go nuts. They will live for so long, and then your swords, your axes, your sword masters, they'll just be able to maneuver around the field and obliterate every weak point in your enemy army. Just these guys are basically like a stable element, a stable core of your army that you dream of. And they're just so good. Of course, you do need to upgrade your barrack to a pretty high level. You might need to get it all the way to the very top, but you don't need to wait for reforms to get these guys. So once you have an opportunity, start playing with them. They will just add this stability to the Boii army that otherwise you kind of lack. Like, between these melee infantry units, until you get this unit in late game, there's nothing super stable here. Like, your medium swordsmen, only 15 armor, so they really can't be stable. Axemen don't have great melee attack or melee defense. Like, they are ultimately a shock unit. That's the role of Axemen, so you don't want to have a main line of Axemen. And then, of course, these guys don't have shields, so they're not exactly a competent mainline. These light spearmen, I mean, it's in their name, they're pretty lightly armored, and they are a light mass unit, so while you can absolutely have them as your mainline for your second army, you know, in early game, eventually they will get outclassed. So this is the way that you progress your mainline into staying as stable as it needs to be. You know, you can't rely on flaky units. You need some stability, and these guys will provide it. Now, in theory, your phalanx should provide it, but this Boii shield wall spearman is not good. It claims we're the backbone of the Boii infantry line, but that's over my dead body. Don't bring these guys. They only have 15 armor. How could you have a hoplite phalanx with 15 armor? That's equivalent to Greek levy hoplites. 39 morale ain't good either. Now sure, for melee attack and defense, a charge bonus and weapon damage are competent. I mean, they're like pretty good, like mid-tier spear stats when it comes to that, but this unit's just so lackluster. Plus it comes from your second population class, which is like, imagine the trade-off between like these guys and your axemen and your swords. How can you ever justify bringing the shield wall spearmen? They're cheap, but they're, in my opinion, not worth the money, even then. I'd rather bring these Boii light spearmen. Just this phalanx is awful. Don't bring it. Negligible that it's on this roster. Only use it in like a city defense if you're desperate. Now, moving to your missile infantry. You don't have great options, but you have some good ones. Your Boii slinger, I mean, they're good. I mean, every single Celtic slinger is pretty good. This is just a generic one, but the generic one is plenty strong. 11 missile damage, 190 range, but only 1 armor, so they definitely are pretty weak. in terms of like their melee capabilities. They will die to a cavalry charge. They'll die if they get picked on by enemy skirmishers for too long, if they only have 30 base morale, so they have plenty capacity to run. But the Boii Slinger is pretty dang decent. They don't carry shields though. That's kind of a negative part. They don't carry shields, so they don't have the survivability that a lot of slingers do. Like, I believe that pretty much every other Celtic slinger does carry a shield. But these guys do. But the Boii slingers are cheaper. That's the thing. So if you want to save money because you spent it all on your infantry, you can bring them. Now moving on, you have Boii skirmishers. These guys are okay. The problem is that I like my Celtic skirmishers to be very offensive once they've gotten rid of their ammunition, but these guys don't. They only have 6 melee attack, but then 15 melee defense. So ideally, these guys would be pretty good, pretty stable, kind of like a Greek Peltis, but they don't do that because they only have 1 armor. Now, their actual skirmish capacity is really good, though. 90 range and 22 missile damage is obscene for a skirmisher of this quality. So these guys aren't really all that useful for melee. I really don't think that this collection of stats is going to help you a whole lot. Just very awkward numbers, low attack, low charge, but high defense but low armor and low morale. I don't think that these stats are going to be very combat effective. I don't think a defense is going to help you all that much. But these missile stats are really good. So this is purely a javelin throwing skirmisher. So if you want to do a lot of damage really quickly, bring these guys, but that's their sole purpose. They're not a hybrid. Now, the Boii archer is very, very, very good. It's a very good low-tier archer. Now, they're not like comparable to a high-tier archer, don't get me wrong, but they just have utility, okay? Like 15 missile damage and 165 range is competent. It's average, which, considering that basically all other Gallic archers are terrible, well, almost all of them. The Nervii also have a good archer, but a lot of Gallic archers are terrible. It's still pretty good. It's still useful. And their combat stats are better than the average archer, too, because they have 16 armor penetrating damage, 7 melee attack, which means they'll actually hit relatively often, and 20 charge bonus. These guys can do pretty good damage when charging into the enemy flank. Now, for lack of melee defense, for lack of shields, and for lack of armor, 8 armor isn't terrible, but it's not great, will mean that they will die when being charged, as you'd expect of a kind of lower tier archer. But ultimately, this is a very, very good unit. This is a very, very good low tier archer option. Of these 3, I would just favor the Boii archer. I mean, it says they're amongst the best archers in the Celtic world. I mean, that's pretty good. But yeah, as it says here as well, they can barely sustain any close combat. These guys are purely for charging the enemy flanks once they've expanded their ammunition. You throw them into late game when the slog is coming to an end and they can turn the tide. Now, your Boii Knight Warriors are a really interesting unit. They're an archer, but they're an archer that's also like a hybrid shock infantry unit. 28 weapon damage is obscene, dude. For weapon damage, so basically like when they hit, when they, strike with their weapon and actually score a hit on an opponent, it does almost as much damage as your late Boii heavy swordsman. I hope that's a testament to how powerful these guys are. 10 melee defense means that they have some resiliency too, and 19 charge bonus ain't bad, although not great. These Boii archers have more, just to give context. But these guys also are a relatively vulnerable unit. 8 armor isn't amazing, and 165 range obviously is not phenomenal for an archer. Like a step archer would shoot like 20 more range, or really any elite archer besides Cretans would. So ultimately, like, this unit is just a typical, just a completely average basic archer, but it can do really good shock damage. And considering you're already like very like rich shock components here, you're just so spoiled for shock infantry by having this unit too. And also, it has 150 men rather than the typical 131, so that'll make them even more combat effective once they are in melee, and maybe lessen the impact of his lesser range, because they will shoot more arrows too. compared to enemy skirmishers. So this is just overall a great unit, but you do pay for them, guys. You do definitely pay quite a bit for them. And they do come from your second population class too. So be wary. Instead of bringing one of these, you could bring swordsmen, right? You could bring your swords. So that's definitely a trade-off for you. Now your cavalry is terrible in my opinion. Like particularly just the... how do I put this? Like, okay, both these cavalry units come from your elite population class, your first population class. So mind you, getting cavalry does limit your ability to bring these noble spearmen, which will actually have an amazing impact. An amazing impact on your army's competence. This cavalry unit sucks. It has worse stats than Greek citizen cavalry. That's all you should know. They come from your first population class. We're technically a noble cavalry. They have they're worse statistically than a Greek citizen cavalry. The most mundane average unit in Rome 2. So yeah, these guys are pretty bad. Like, that's not to say that they're useless. Like, citizen cavalry isn't useless. They can beat enemy skirmishers. They can, you know, stay in combat against enemy cavalry for a reasonable amount of time. They can commit to a hammer and anvil. Like, these guys will work, but they'll just get slaughtered by any faction that actually has good cavalry. So I'd be wary about expending your first population class for these guys, yet it's not like you have better options, so... you know, if you need cavalry, bring him, but ultimately, if you have the ability to recruit from, like, local populations, you know, get mercenaries, get AOR units, I would not bring your own cavalry. This is not a good option. Now, your late Boii noble cavalry is a little bit better. I mean, they do have elite cavalry stats in terms of their combat abilities, but they don't have elite cavalry armor. 33 armor is pretty bad for a unit of his caliber. And once again, they come from your noble class and they are very expensive. So that's the thing, guys. Like, you're expending first population class with Boii cavalry for, like, inferior units. Like, most factions will have better versions of these that'll come from, like, their second population class or something like that. So ultimately, due to that reason, I feel like these two cavalry options are just generally inferior. Like, particularly amongst Gallic factions, this may just be the worst cavalry faction, boys. Amongst all the Gauls, with the exception of the Galatians, are probably a bit worse. So yeah, when it comes to cavalry, not good. And this is just a crappy, terrible skirmish cavalry that basically every faction gets from, you know, pretty low barrack. Wouldn't really bring these guys, honestly. Just in general, with the Boii, if you can find a place to just recruit mercenary cavalry or something, just do that. Don't bring these. Get Scythians or anything, really. But yeah, that's the Boii roster. Ultimately, I think it's pretty powerful, particularly because shock infantry can be used so effectively against the AI. There's definitely things that you can do with this roster, but simultaneously, it obviously has weaknesses. From not having shielded slingers to just having relatively few options for skirmishers, and really nothing good at long range. Like, these guys are interesting because they're kind of like hybrid melee skirmishers. Like, they have pretty interesting melee capabilities despite being pretty like low-end skirmishers, but at the end of the day, your skirmishers aren't that good at skirmishing. If that makes any sense. Your cavalry is not good for the reasons I just mentioned. Your phalanx is terrible. You know, you have two interesting spearmen, but it's not like this one's going to have great long-term purpose. And this one does come from your first population class, making them somewhat hard to recruit. But it can't talk crap about the shock infantry selection for the Boii. I mean, you just have something that fills every role. From your swords, which can charge pretty hard, from these axes, which are just way more survivable than most axes, to your Celtic swordsmen who will shred everything in their path. You just have so many great options, and even a low-tier option, which is surprisingly strong. So because of that, I believe that their roster deserves some accolades, but also, you know, you have to understand the limitations of the Boii. So I'll give them a 5 out of 10. They're average, but not average because they're uninteresting. Just average because they do some things very well and some things very poorly, so it has to meet in the middle. But I like factions that are more extreme like that. Like, I don't like factions that are the masters of mediocrity. And this is not. The Boii just range from excellent to terrible. That's just what they do, which is kind of cool. Because of that, and because of her unique position as kind of like the gateway to Gaul that holds the Germans back, I actually feel like this campaign's kind of cool. In fact, I plan on playing a Boii campaign from beginning to end. So I'd say in terms of how much you have to play this campaign, I'd say it's like a 7 out of 10. Sure, it's not the most storied campaign in the world. I don't think the Boii are, have an exceptionally interesting history or anything like that. But at the end of the day, I think that their campaign is quite cool. I think that their units are quite cool. So a 7 out of 10. I think it'll be a pretty fun campaign. Definitely more fun than average. Now, in terms of difficulty, I don't think that it'll be a very difficult campaign. Even with a debuff against the Germans, with the Germans being your primary opponent, and just having gold at the beginning, having the ability to very quickly get a full province as a barbarian faction, is just really, really powerful. Just like my Dacian campaign, you can quickly snowball into having a couple of provinces really early on, regardless of what units that you're using, as long as you're just managing your provinces well and recruiting the better units of your roster. And keep in mind, like, almost all of these units are available from, like, early game. You just need to have the right barrack for it. And you have some really powerful units in early game, like this one, quickly get access to these swordsmen and these axemen and stuff. So I just think it's not super hard. I feel like maybe a 3 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. Like, not super duper easy, but definitely not, like, one of the harder campaigns. Probably one of the easier barbarian campaigns, too. So yeah, that's what I have it when it comes to the Boii. I think that they're a pretty cool faction. I definitely don't think that they're like a game-changing faction in the context of Rome 2 Divide et Impera, but they're a pretty cool choice. And, amongst the Gauls, I definitely think that they're worth a playthrough. In fact, I think that they may just be my favorite Gallic faction. But who knows? As I go along, making guides for the rest of the Gallic factions, I might change my mind, but I definitely like them more than the Arverni thus far. That's it, guys. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed this video and found it informative, please subscribe and like. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next guide. Bye for now.